As one young man held on for dear life on the stern railing of a Ropax ferry, flames engulfed much of the deck and screams of horror filled the night air. An oil-slicked sea was also ablaze, and the young man held on tightly for well over an hour, awaiting rescue. His heart broke and guilt flooded him as he listened to the cries of the innocent as tugboat operators rescued him from his perch. His thoughts, plagued with pain, wandered to one thing: why me? Why only me? Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. MV Moby Prince started her life cycle in the Camel Laird shipyard of Birkenhead, a shipyard that also built CSS Alabama for the Confederate States Navy, the ocean liner SS Arendora Star and her sisters, and the beautiful aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, among hundreds of other vessels. Moby Prince was labeled Yard Number 1331. She was built in 1967 and launched on February 2, 1968 as Koningin Juliana for the ferry operator Stoomvaartmaatschappij Zeeland of the Netherlands, and she was used there on the Harwich to Hook of Holland route from 1968 until 1984. Initially, she was sold off to Tromp Leiden, another Dutch company, but they went bankrupt. After this, she was sold to Navarma Lines, which eventually became the Moby Lines in September of 1985, and her name was changed to the Moby Prince. Here, her port of registry would be Livorno, Italy, and she ran regular services between Livorno and Olbia in Sardinia. Her IMO number was 6808806, and her career was rather unnoteworthy leading up to the incident. Before we get into that, let's look at her specs. The Moby Prince was a Ropax ferry with her tonnage sitting at 6,682 gross tons. She was 429 feet 10 inches long, had a beam of 67 feet 2 inches wide, and a draft of 16 feet 9 inches deep. As Moby Prince, she was white with a dark blue hull, one dark blue funnel, and a large blue whale scrawled across her side next to the words Navarma Lines. Her passenger capacity sat at 1,200 passengers, and her crew on her final voyage was 66 crew, including Captain Ugo Cessa, so we can safely say she averaged around this number. As for propulsion, she had 4 MAN Augsburg diesel engines which powered 2 controllable pitch propellers and 1 bow thruster, giving her an average service speed of 21 knots. She was a beautiful ship, and we love celebrating beautiful ships. If you're enjoying this video, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Want to live like Eleanor? Visit our Amazon storefront in the description of this episode to see our favorite shipwreck essentials and help support the channel. Without any further ado, it's time to get into the disaster. Okay, a tiny bit of setup here. This disaster starts as a collision, so you need to be acquainted with the other ship involved here. The other ship, the oil tanker Agip Abruzzo, was built in 1977. She was 1,085 feet long and had a beam of 170 feet wide. The ship was owned by SPA Milan, flew the Italian flag, and was mastered by Captain Renato Superina. On this day, she was carrying a total cargo of around 78,737 long tons of Iranian light crude oil. Now, let's set the scene. Late one night on April 10, 1991, the Moby Prince was docked in Livorno, preparing for a routine trip to Olbia. She was loaded with 75 passengers and 66 crew, including Captain Cessa. Meanwhile, Agip Abruzzo was also in the harbor, anchored 2 nautical miles off the coast from the port, allegedly in the legal waiting area to enter the port. There is a third ship that has been discovered to play a part in this that was discovered when the inquiry was reopened, and we'll get to that one when we cover the inquiries. I know some of you might be asking yourselves about that third one, and we will get there. For now, let's go off of the original information and look at these 2 ships in Livorno Harbor. At 10:03 p.m., the Moby Prince was heading out of the harbor when she might have suddenly took a sharp left turn, seemingly to avoid something, and she collided with the Agip Abruzzo. The Moby Prince's bow pierced the number 7 cargo tank, spilling around 2,700 metric tons of crude oil onto both ships and into the sea. Between 100 and 300 tons of oil sprayed onto the Moby Prince, which quickly caught fire. Captain Superino of the Agip Abruzzo used full engine power in order to separate the two vessels, and while this worked, this sprayed even more oil all over both ships. At 10:36 p.m., he reported the collision. However, he thought the other ship was a Betalina, a small refueling ship. Unfortunately for everyone involved, errors and miscommunication would play a huge role in this tragic event, as both do with almost all tragedies. After Captain Superina reported the collision and resulting fire aboard his oil tanker, rescuers and firefighters were mobilized, but only to the Agip Abruzzo. They rescued all 30 of her crew and began to extinguish the fire on the oil tanker. Knowing what they did then, prioritizing the oil tanker was the right move. Unfortunately, hindsight is always 20/20, and the Moby Prince would face the consequences. Let's look at the Moby Prince. The Moby Prince's crew hurried from the control room as the fire began spreading, leaving the engines and air conditioning running. The ferry was on its own and began circling away from the location of the collision. Flames lapped at the sea around her and ate away at the ship, further complicating rescue. The fire was eating away at the outside of the hull, starting at the bow, making the lifeboats unusable as it worked its way down the port and starboard sides. The deluxe lounge was fireproofed, and so the crew and passengers, all except one, gathered here. 140 people locked themselves in the deluxe lounge as the fire ate through the decks, working its way down and around the lounge. The fire reached the interior only after the two massive covers between the deck and the upper car compartment gave way from the intense heat. It was only slowed at the prow engine room by fireproof doors, but it made its way around these two. It took roughly half an hour for it to start lapping at the doors of the deluxe lounge. In theory, this should have been a safe place to await rescue, assuming it was not far away as they were close to the harbor. At 10:25 p.m., the ferry's radio operator sent out a mayday call using a portable VHF, and he did not use the fixed radio set since he was not at his post during the disaster, and this was sadly evident by the location of his body later on. It said, quote, "Mayday, Mayday, Moby Prince, Moby Prince. We are in a collision. We are on fire. Firemen needed." The last message sent was harrowing, stating, quote, "Mate, if you do not help us, we will burn. Mayday, Mayday." Since he was using the portable VHF transmitter, the messages he transmitted were too weak to be heard properly. Unfortunately, nobody looked for the Moby Prince until well over an hour later due to the miscommunications. By the time the crew realized rescue would not be quickly, it was too late to escape the lounge. During this excruciating hour and 10 minutes before the first rescuers would arrive, the 140 passengers and crew in the deluxe lounge mostly died from carbon monoxide poisoning as the fumes from the fire were pumped into the lounge from the still running air conditioning. Carbon dioxide, thick black smoke, and other gases from the burning plastic fittings of the ferry were also present in the victims' systems. Most of the bodies were found here, but a few were found on deck without external burns. These people may have tried to escape from the lounge, but would die slowly from the heat and fumes. Rest in peace to the 140 victims of this horrific disaster. Let us take a moment of silence to honor those lost as we run the names of the victims across the screen. At 11:35 p.m., the Moby Prince was located by two tugboat operators, Mauro Valli and Walter Mattei, who would rescue the only survivor. 23-year-old cabin boy Alessio Bertrand, native of Naples, was found hanging onto the ship's stern railing. Later on, he said he'd heard people screaming in pain and fear in the deluxe lounge, but could not help them. He allegedly committed suicide, however, I cannot confirm this. There was a 2021 interview with Bertrand with TG1 where he states that, quote, "The others had to make it too. Why only me? I can't find peace about this." He also stated that, quote, "Every day I live with anxiety, with depression, I take psychotropic drugs." As of 2021 in this interview, he states he still couldn't sleep more than 3 hours a night because of the nightly torments. He was on the ship with his uncle, and after the disaster, he has never been on a ship again. Again, I need to reiterate, I myself cannot find any sources that confirm the claim he committed suicide, but there is that possibility and it has been alleged. Along with Valli and Mattei came Port Authority guardship CP-232. The tugboat operators repeatedly called for help, especially after Bertrand insisted there were still well over 100 people still in danger. Bertrand was put on board on the guardship, which stayed for over half an hour looking for survivors, but then headed back to the port since Bertrand was injured and needed medical attention. Vali and Matei later reported that Bertrand allegedly said, quote, "There is no one to save anymore. They have all been burned to death." He has since denied saying this. Regardless of if he said it or not, that statement was right. The commander of the port of Leghorn, Admiral Sergio Albanese, rushed to the scene aboard the Coast Guard ship CP-250. As part of his duties, he was in charge of coordinating the rescue activities. However, no orders from Admiral Albanese were reported by any officer involved in the rescue operation, and his voice is not once heard in the recordings of the VHF channels that night. He was quickly exonerated during the trial, raising questions about whether he rushed to the site to cover secret military operations by other unidentified ships. That's just a theory, so take it with a grain of salt. Firefighting ships finally arrived on scene to cool the hull, and at 3:30 a.m., another private tugboat captain, Giovanni Veneruso, boarded the Moby Prince. He volunteered to board the ferry to attach a tow line, the first rescuer to board the now hauntingly silent ship after the disaster. This allowed her to be towed into Leghorn Harbor. Other rescuers reached the ship hours later in the morning, when the fire on the wreck was completely out. They'd waited too long, and 140 would pay the price. Just warning you, this next section is graphic. A Carabinieri helicopter left its base early in the morning on April 11, 1991, to join the rescue operations, and while hovering over the Moby Prince, they filmed a corpse lying on its back near the ship's stern. The body was not burned in the least, despite the surroundings being badly scorched by the fire. Later, when the wreck returned to Leghorn Harbor, firemen found the same corpse completely burned by the heat, and this suggested that many people did not burn to death, instead dying slowly and agonizingly from the intense heat and suffocation. This opinion would be thoroughly explored in the trial. Some experts asserted that the corpse on deck was a passenger who, after surviving the fire and suffocation, tried to reach the rescue ship at dawn, but was overcome by heat from the deck's metal, dying of heat exhaustion. Not only were there consequences to those who perished, but there were massive environmental consequences as well. Tons of oil were spread in the water after the collision with the tanker. After the tanker separated from the Moby Prince, this worsened the oil spill. This is one of the two worst environmental disasters in Italian history, along with the explosion of the tanker Amoco Milford Haven on the following day in an unrelated accident near Voltri. According to the International Tanker Owners Pollution Federation Limited, or ITOPF, about 130 kilometers of coastline, mainly to the north, became polluted with oil over the next few weeks. In September of 1992, a videotape recorded by a passenger shortly before the collision was found in good shape, confirming that the flames and heat were quite tolerable where the passengers were sheltered, and a quicker rescue response could have saved them all. The fumes would be the killer of those in the lounge, dying in an absence of hope. The charred hulk of the Moby Prince remained docked at Leghorn until May 17, 1998, when she sank in the harbor due to the fire damage and sitting for so many years. After this, she was raised and towed to Aliaga, Turkey, where she was scrapped. The tragedy of the Moby Prince resulted in the worst disaster for the Italian merchant marine since the end of World War II, and was a complete miscarriage of responsibility. Had responders been more cognizant, how many would still be alive today? These questions may never be answered, but we will answer more after this short break. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Time to look at causes and the investigations. Let's look at some of the causes of this disaster. Among the officially accepted causes of the disaster, fog played the leading role. Judges confirmed that a natural phenomenon called advection fog, or a quick buildup of thick fog in a small area caused by hot, moist air reaching the cold sea surface, was experienced that evening in the zone around the Agip Abruzzo, preventing the Moby Prince from spotting the tanker. This has been rebutted by several qualified witnesses that the visibility was in fact good, and that the fog seen might have been smoke from after the collision. This included Guardia di Finanza Captain Cesare Gentile, commanding a guard ship that joined the first rescue efforts at 10:35 p.m., and he testified that, quote, "At the time, the weather was excellent, the sea was calm, and visibility was perfect." The position of the Agip Abruzzo is debated and could have contributed to this disaster. The ship's commander declared he was at anchor with the prow pointed south, but later revised his account. The tanker appeared to be heading south in the hours after the collision, as evidenced by a video recording found months after the disaster. It was never clarified if the collision was caused by the ferry going off course, or if the tanker was mistakenly positioned in the exit cone of the harbor, where parking was strictly forbidden. Think of it like backing into a parallel parking spot with the front end of your vehicle hanging out into the middle of traffic. The first position reported by the Agip Abruzzo was recorded in the VHF transmission with the first Mayday request, and Captain Superina is clearly audible and reported a position inside the no anchor zone. Based on this initial declaration, the collision can be explained with the Agip Abruzzo being anchored wrongfully in the legitimate path of the Moby Prince. This position was discovered after the mysteriously missing logbook was discovered. Human error is a factor in almost every single disaster, so it's not surprising that it's listed here. Initially, blame was put on the crew of the Moby Prince for not using their radar equipment, for not following proper procedures for harbor maneuvering, and for speeding. The press wrongly reported that the crew was distracted by the UEFA Cup Winners' Cup football semifinal, but was decisively refuted when Bertrand was interrogated and declared that the commanding officers were at the helm of the ferry where they should have been. Rudder malfunction could have possibly played a role in the loss of the Moby Prince, and there was initial speculation surrounding a rudder malfunction or problems with any other critical navigation system. However, these were dismissed by early surveys by Leghorn's prosecutors. Next, we venture into the land of conspiracy. The first highly unlikely hypothesis that the judges of the first trial considered was that a bomb aboard the ferry sent it off course, causing it to crash into the tanker. At first, this was considered likely, but was swiftly dismissed during the trial due to expert and other testimony, especially that of Bertrand, the only survivor. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, there were speculations that military ships or weapon traffic was at play. It's still unclear whether the US or other naval vessels were present in the vicinity of the disaster. At the time of the collision, radio recordings and verbal accounts imply that unregistered ships were probably present, and transfers from cargo ships bearing munitions were alleged. The presence of U.S. Navy ships or ships of other nations' militaries was repeatedly reported, but the real presence, identity, and activities are currently unknown. American ships frequently visited the harbor as Camp Darby is nearby. Undercover military ships in this harbor were also not unusual, and neither was the use of fake names when ships were employed in secret military activities. Arms traffic in the Leghorn harbor was allegedly linked to the disaster, as an explanation of the covert ship movements and of the bureaucratic hurdles when seeking official documentation from the military commands. A rumor that the United States and NATO military headquarters had radar reports and satellite photographs of the disaster received widespread attention, but was later denied by the respective commands. The presence of a Bettelina was never confirmed. Of course, Superina confirmed many times that the ship struck a small tugboat in those early calls for help, grossly mistaking the real nature of the gruesome event. Those calls were undoubtedly influenced by the confusion from the impact and the low visibility from the smoke. Some sailors from the Agip Abruzzo testified that they saw the silhouette of a ship in the fire, but only a few of them recognized that it could possibly have been a ferry. There are three main elements that seem to point to a Bettelina possibly actually being on scene, and they are, number 1, the fact that tanker number 6 of the Agip Abruzzo was not correctly sealed, as if it were being loaded or unloaded. Number 2, a length of pipe commonly used to refuel small boats was found, partly burned near the tanker. And 3, the record marked 11:30 p.m. from the diary of the captain of Eftim Jr., quote, "We learned that 2 ships, a passenger ferry and a tanker, had collided and that fire had broken out. I chose to stay at anchor because the great number of boats moving away from the burning ships and the many boats taking part in the search and rescue operations in zero visibility." However, pointing against this theory are mostly verbal witnesses, among them the harbor spotter Romero Ricci, pilot Federico Sgheri, and many other officers from Agip Abruzzo and harbor personnel. In 2008, it was found that Teresa, another ship, had been present at the scene, but her involvement remains unclear. A mysterious audio recording from 10:45 p.m. that night, just after the collision, was discovered in 1991. It was in English and said, quote, "This is Teresa. This is Teresa for the ship 1 in Livorno Anchorage. I'm moving out. I'm moving out." No ship named Teresa was registered in the harbor records, and it is still unknown what is the ship 1 they are referring to. This only adds to the head-scratching and conspiracy. In a third report issued on September 15, 2022, after a July 2021 parliamentary inquiry, a third vessel was allegedly involved in the Moby Prince disaster. Quote, "The Moby Prince collided with the Agip Abruzzo oil tanker because of the presence of a third ship that suddenly appeared before the ferry, provoking the left turn that caused the accident," the report stated. The probe into the Moby Prince disaster was reopened by Italy's parliament in July of 2021 when legislators realized the initial investigations conducted in the media aftermath of the incident did not identify its exact causes nor result in any convictions, spoiler alert. Speaking of convictions, let's look at the trials. Immediately following the disaster, the Leghorn public prosecutor began proceedings against unknown persons for failure to assist in culpable homicide. The first trial began on November 29, 1995. In this trial, 3rd Officer Valentino Rolla of the Agip Abruzzo, the acting commander at the time, was charged with multiple culpable homicides and arson. Angelo Cedro, deputy commander of the Port Authority, and Guard Officer Lorenzo Ceccheschi were charged with multiple culpable homicides for the lateness of the rescues. And sailor Gianluigi Spartano was charged with culpable homicide for missing the ferry's Mayday. Though charges were brought against Achille Onorato, the owner of Navarma, and Agip Abruzzo's captain Renato Superina, these were dropped. 2 years later, on the night of October 31, 1997, the trial came to an end in a very tense atmosphere, with many holding their breath. In a courtroom full of police and carabinieri, jury president Germano Lamberti read out the verdict: not guilty. These were partially revised on appeal, with the 3rd Criminal Court in Florence declaring that further proceedings were not to be taken because of the statute of limitations. In November of 1997, 11 members of Parliament proposed a new commission of inquiry to look further into the disaster. At the request of Captain Cessa's sons, in 2006, the Leghorn public prosecutor opened a new inquiry into the disaster. New images of the disaster were found in the offices of the Leghorn public prosecutor, confirming the presence of satellite reconnaissance of the area on the night of the collision. In 2009, the Association of Victims' Relatives asked Italian President Giorgio Napolitano to ask American President Barack Obama to disclose the radar recordings, satellite images, and other information available to American authorities. It's unclear whether President Obama released this information. In April of 2009, parliamentarian Ermete Realacci called for a new inquiry into the alleged presence of other ships, especially that of the U.S. Navy, in the harbor on the night of the disaster. On November 16, 2007, Fabio Piselli, a former Army paratrooper, told the press of new information about the disaster he'd uncovered while investigating the death of a relative working for the U.S. Embassy in Rome. He met with attorney Carlo Palermo, but was later allegedly attacked by 4 people who kidnapped him, shut him in the trunk of a car, and lit it on fire. However, he did allegedly escape. An inquiry into the incident was opened. In 2009, sole survivor Alessio Bertrand was interrogated again, and the seabed of the harbor was searched, yielding new evidence. A memorial tablet by Molo Medesio in Leghorn bears the names and ages of the 140 victims of the disaster, and the commune of Livorno dedicated a square and many public events to the victims. It is crucial that we remember that the victims and sole survivor of this event are so much more than just numbers and historical record. They were family members, friends, loved ones, and cherished members of their communities that are all still surely missed. Rest in peace to all of those who perished, and may their loved ones find solace. Fires plague ships more frequently than we realize, and in 1963, TSMS Laconia caught fire while on a Christmas cruise of the Canary Islands. In the midst of the panic and flames, boiler explosions rocked the ocean liner, leaving devastation in its wake. In next week's episode, we explore this tragedy.